Nickel Plate Road number 765 continues to make history in the 21st century. First, returning to the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad after a hiatus. Second, revitalizing the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad Steam in the Valley event. Third, hauling the employee specials for the W&LE's 35th anniversary. And final, participating in a NKP trifecta lash-up that some say may rank to be one of the rarest contests within the decade. We invite you to witness the Queen Steam Star of the Northeast fulfilling this role within this program. On a warm, sunny day with a temperature of 80 degrees in Bellevue, Ohio, there was high anticipation for the arrival of the Queen Steam Star of the Northeast, Nickel Plate Road number 765. Thanks to Norfolk Southern, the 765 was permitted to be towed as a deadhead move across the NS Fostoria District en route to the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad for their Steam in the Valley event. The 765 arrived in Bellevue later than anticipated due to a rail train holding up traffic as it had departed from its home base in New Haven, Indiana, in the mid-morning. Expecting its arrival around lunchtime, Viloco Valve Productions I were on the scene to document this historical moment for its return to the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad for the first time in 10 years, as it was scheduled to proceed onto the Wheeling and Lake Erie's Hartland Subdivision en route to Akron, Ohio to interchange with CVSR. Upon receiving the signal from the CSX dispatcher for the Wellington Diamond, within their Wheeling and Lake Erie track authority, a speed restriction of 10 miles per hour was imposed for a mile in between Wellington and Spencer, Ohio, enabling the acquisition of an additional location. In order to take the Wheeling and Lake Erie's Akron Subdivision, it becomes necessary proceeding towards Spencer, they must decelerate to ease into that connection. This facilitated the insertion of an additional spot as the daylight diminished. This was not originally intended on our itinerary, but in consolation, we would observe a magnificent sunset amidst the fields of Ohio as she accelerates up to track speed. We are in the midst of downtown Medina, Ohio at the 8th consecutive crossing within a mile, which implies a bunch of whistle action through all this crossing madness. A couple years ago, the 80s tuning returned to the Locomotive, which was a shock to rail fans, as this widely recognized and appreciated tuning of the whistle in the 20th century was never thought to resurface. This whistle would become the staple throughout the West Virginia mountains during the New River train excursions. However, many may not know that this Nathan 6 chime aboard the 765 belongs to NKP Berkshire number 700, as her original whistle sustained damages within the first several years of her second lease on life. After numerous tunings implemented over the years, railway enthusiasts expressed elation upon the resurgence of the true voice of NKP 765, following a hiatus of 3 decades. Now let's watch this old iron horse make its presence known throughout the city with some 80s tuning goodness. And remember folks, listen for the whistle. Since the daylight diminished after Medina, we headed straight for downtown Akron. Here at this scene around the bend lies a trestle, and the old-school engineer executed the entry perfectly with the wailing of the whistle and the accompanying stack talk echoing off the buildings. This was quite the way to celebrate that they had reached their destination after this long day. With this scene just after 10 p.m., the sensory experience was remarkable for both Viloco Valve Productions and myself. Not only did it mark the culmination of our celebration of witnessing 765's debut return to the wheeling, and our first experience with the 1980s tuning, but this moment also evoked childhood nostalgia. For viewers familiar with 765's new River Train programs, as it just navigated that S-curve behind us, the echo of the whistle going away should have given you the new River Train vibes. In this current scene, though, the movement along the interchange track occurs within the Carter Lumber facility. These tracks span a significant paved area to facilitate more efficient loading and unloading of lumber from the flat car. As shown, the Mars light projects a figure 8 beam while navigating the interchange track curve. Once 765 clears the switch, it will be thrown to allow 765 to reverse onto CVSR trackage. Subsequently, EMD GP15 number 1448, known as one of the Pumpkins, will tow the consist up to Fitzwater Yard in Brecksville, Ohio. This locomotive was acquired through a lease agreement with Larry's Truck and Electric for use in Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad's tourist operations. As midnight approaches, number 1448 heads northward, making this our final location. I am confident that the crew, along with the rail enthusiasts present, shared a readiness for sleep. This day's conclusion signifies the beginning of such a landmark season for the 765 in 2025, thanks to the efforts of Norfolk Southern, the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway Company, and the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railway, and nonetheless, the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society, who own and operate the Nickel Plate Road 765. With these efforts, this enabled the return of Steam in the Valley, as we were present to document the event, as it had been several years since I had last attended. I would cover both weekends, which would encompass footage from Friday, April 25th to Saturday, April 26th, whereas the following weekend coverage included would be from Saturday, May 3rd to Sunday, May 4th. Transitioning from favorable weather conditions to a monsoonal precipitation regime, currently C. Henderson Rail Productions, Lane's Trains, Middle Tennessee Rail Productions, and I are on the scene at the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railway for the 5:30 p.m. Steam in the Valley trip on Friday, April 25th. In this particular scene, we would witness a phenomenal performance with the 765 charging up to speed thanks to the skilled crew aboard, passing the Cuyahoga River. Following this event, there was a notable increase in precipitation that persisted throughout the night, resulting in flooding issues that led to the cancellation of the 9 a.m. and 1:15 p.m. excursion scheduled for Saturday, April 26. As the day continued on, the sunlight evaporated the water, allowing for the 5:30 p.m. trip to commence. Excursions begin at Independence, Ohio, at the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad's Rockside Station. Here the train can be observed passing the crossing just north of the station to conduct a photo entrance run-by, allowing passengers to photograph and videotape the steam locomotive that they would be riding behind this evening. This wouldn't be the only opportunity to get photos and videos of the steam locomotive, as at Brecksville, a photo stop would occur, enabling passengers to disembark and witness two run-bys, one slow and one fast, of the steam locomotive charging through the valley before reboarding and continuing southward towards Indigo Lake. At Indigo Lake, the diesel locomotive at the rear will tow the train northward, back to Rockside Station, concluding the excursion. Currently, the 5:30 p.m. trip is operated by a talented engineer who quilled the whistle perfectly, along with providing ample whistle action approaching the crossing, in addition to sounding the whistle adequately entering the station, likely to satisfy all passengers on the platform wishing to capture photographs or videos of the 765 before boarding their excursion. In the tranquil setting offered by the Cuyahoga River, we chose to undertake a hike isolating from the crowds in order to document the 5:30 p.m. excursion. Due to the substantial precipitation from the previous night, the hike-in was notably wet and muddy. However, this experience was rendered invaluable by the 765 sputtering by with a nice white plume of smoke, following along with some nice DAC talk. Transitioning to the following weekend, specifically the evening of Saturday, May 3rd, we are in position at the start of The Hill for the 5:30 p.m. excursion. In this scene, as a result of the implementation of a speed restriction coming into town, the train ended up stalling due to a reduced speed and wet rail conditions. Regrettably, the precipitation during the prior weekend continued into this weekend. The crew successfully initiated Nickel Plate Road number 765 from a standstill without encountering any difficulties, and provided a remarkable performance for the audience gathered at the hill, exemplifying the battle between man, machine, and nature. It was satisfying to witness 765 emitting black smoke from its smokestack, as most refer to it as rolling coal. In addition, the throttle and the reverser being applied in front of us in order to tackle the grade, creating great stack talk, and they included a shave and a haircut, as this angle wouldn't be possible for the gracious homeowner who granted us permission to stand on her property. So this dramatic scene wouldn't be included in this program. We give her a big thank you. Our next location would include the ferry move from Rockside Station after dropping off passengers back to Fitzwater Yard for the locomotive to overnight and be serviced for the next day's excursions. present in the midst of the hill during the 9 a.m. May 4th excursion. We are waiting for 765 to tackle the grade, with a mama geese and her chicks trying to cross the tracks. As the 765 approached closer, we gained anxiety, hoping the mama and her chicks would get off the tracks. Luckily, at the last minute, the mama flew away with the chicks running straight from the tracks, avoiding anything gruesome. In consolation, though, it added some natural wildlife with the old iron horse galloping by. Positioned at a significant altitude at the Brecksville overlook, the 1:15 p.m. passengers arranged themselves trackside following their disembarkation from the train in preparation to document 2 photo runbys. concluding our chase for the southbound portion of the 1:15 p.m. excursion at the swamp, we successfully recorded the northbound return voyage with ALCO/MLW FPA locomotive number 6777 at the helm. As the train slowly rolls back to Rockside Station, we would anticipate the arrival of the ferry move returning to the Fitzwater Yard. The locomotive will undergo servicing in preparation for the next day's tasks, as this would entail Nickel Plate Road number 765 deadheading to the headquarters of the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway Company in Brewster, Ohio. As the following weekend, there would be employee special trips scheduled for the 35th anniversary of the Wheeling and Lake Erie. In this next scene, the engineer and fireman on board is a father-son duo delivering an impressive performance characterized by a very distinct bark from the 765 that I have never heard before, along with notable whistle action as the train progresses forward, rolling coal, traversing by the Cuyahoga River. rising early to secure a spot in the photo line, awaiting for Nickel Plate Road number 765 to perform a deadhead move from the Fitzwater Yard, which is just north of this 1931 built concrete arch viaduct known as the Brecksville Northfield Bridge. Due to the forthcoming track maintenance, their departure was delayed. Nevertheless, all of us present at Brecksville relished the favorable sunny conditions. Operating the remainder of CVSR trackage to Akron, Ohio, NKP 765 would interchange with the Wheeling and Lake Erie's Akron Subdivision once again, before entering the Britton Yard. After exiting the yard, they would traverse the Cleveland Subdivision, which has had a 68-year absence of steam, with their final destination being Brewster, Ohio. One of the pumpkins was dispatched in advance of the 765 to verify there were no obstructions impeding their path and to confirm the completion and safety of the track work, thereby ensuring a safe passage for the Nickel Plate Road number 765. With the track authority only warranted to Peninsula, Ohio, the train halted to disembark people required in Peninsula while accommodating individuals boarding for the journey southward. Certain photographic opportunities were executed during this brief intermission prior to a subsequent track authority being issued to Akron, once the Route 303 crossing was flagged properly. Nickel Plate Road number 765 is a 284 wheel arrangement steam locomotive classified as an S2 type Berkshire. It was constructed on September 8, 1944, with a maximum boiler pressure of 245 psi, generating 4,500 horsepower. The locomotive has a height of 15 feet 8 inches and can reach speeds up to 80 miles an hour with an overall length of 100 feet. This represents the first instance of the superpower design, which was crafted by William E. Woodard of Lima Locomotive Works. The Nickel Plate Road transformed from an underdog to an efficient, high-speed freight line by integrating 80 Berkshires into its fleet, which excelled over the existing diesel locomotives. The elevation project of the NKP in Fort Wayne, Indiana commenced in 1953 and concluded in 1955, highlighted by Berkshire number 767 parading on the new elevated tracks with a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Before this event, the 765 was the actual first train to traverse these new rails. At the end of the steam era, both 765 and 767 were stored in the East Wing engine house. While many met the scrapper's torch, there was a desire to preserve the 767 by the city of Fort Wayne. Ultimately, NKP 765 was in better cosmetic and mechanical condition, as in 1958, the 765 was fired up to provide heat for a stranded passenger train. The Roundhouse discreetly renumbered it to 767, displaying it in Lawton Park in May of 1963. The original number 767 was scrapped in Chicago in 1964. In 1972, the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society was established to oversee the preservation and operation of Berkshire number 765. September 1st, 1979, the 765 operated under its own steam for the first time in 21 years. During the 1980s and 90s, the FWRS successfully established a historical excursion career for the Berk, and the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society would be the first all-volunteer nonprofit organization to restore and operate a mainline steam locomotive. As in 1993, the 765 underwent its 1472-day FRA rebuild to reemerge in 2005, ready to make railroad history once again. positioned at the Brewster Diamond in order to capture 765 crossing the R.J. Corman Railway Company and this unusual signal standing guard. As it is a transplanted Pittsburgh and West Virginia Railway R2 style signal manufactured by the Union Switch and Signal Company. Documenting this was high on our priority list as it closely resembles an NKP signal. This signifies a landmark event for NKP 765 as it reaches the headquarters of the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway Company for the first time since the railway's inception as a corporation in 1990. Shortly after the arrival of 765, a stone train designated as WE 701 entered the yard led by one of their fallen flag units, Rio Grande EMD GP40 number 302. Remnants of the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad can be seen within these fading reporting marks as originally ordered for the Rock Island Railroad. They became available for sale in the 70s when acquired by the BLE. Serving them for almost 5 decades, most have been scrapped, while some were offered for sale, hence why you can see one on the rails serving the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad today. The voice of Wheeling and Lake Erie, Berkshire, number 6428, returns home on May 10, 2025. Her Wheeling and Lake Erie 5-chime whistle is aboard the auxiliary valve on NKP 765, galloping up to track speed with the inaugural 35th anniversary employee special of the day. 3 employee specials at 9 a.m., 12 p.m., and 3 p.m. will be conducted to New Cumberland, Ohio, and back to HQ. This allowed for one shot for each special to be acquired. This evokes a sense of nostalgia for her since her last excursions operated out of Brewster occurred in 1982 during the era of the Norfolk and Western Railway's ownership. Positioned at the eastern end of the diamond to capture the Burke as it crosses the RJC Railway, under watch is a reproduction searchlight signal. The train horn you previously heard was a Leslie RS5T installed on the Wheeling and Lake Erie's social media manager's personal Burlington Northern High Rail truck. Many were perplexed expecting it to be the R.J. Corman Railway, however none of the locomotives listed on their roster assigned to these lines are currently equipped with 5T horns. This was a horn versus whistle battle at a distance, which was totally unexpected while waiting at the Boulevard Cemetery for the 12 p.m. employee special. In our final shot of the day, we showcase a serene pond while the engine undergoes a significant thrashing, presenting notable stack talk and eliciting a feeling of nostalgia for the Norfolk Southern's 21st Century Steam program, which took place in the previous decade. during which we witnessed some of the 765's participation in this program. Similarities would include observing the Burke achieving mainline track speeds, displaying a sensory experience for both passengers and rail fans trackside, applying guest whistles which have railroad heritage to the territory being covered, and offering an exclusive event to thank the dedicated workers of the railroad, upholding the backbone of America's freight infrastructure. The initial diesel selected for these employee specials was the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society's NKP EMDSD-9 number 358. However, owing it to mechanical problems, it was substituted by the 35th anniversary unit number 7024. As the 765 reverses back to the shops after detaching from the passenger consist, it was commendable to observe a partnership between the railroad and the organization, offering a distinctive opportunity for employees and rail enthusiasts to engage in, as I think everyone can agree we like to see these things transpire. Not only did the Burke gain recognition on her resume from this historical endeavor, the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway Company will be forever remembered for what they offered on this day, as back in the steam era, there were a small portion of Nickel Plate Road Berkshires assigned out of Brewster on the Wheeling and Lake Erie, when leased for a period of time by the Nickel Plate Road. As we hope to see developments like this come to fruition again, we love to see history be replicated. Concluding the day, the crew is granted a day off before deadheading the Burke and her consist the following Monday from HQ to the Indiana Northeastern Railroad. The whistle resonates within the forest while the tranquil waters mirror the picturesque sky, with the rail bridge splitting through. Anticipating ample time due to a freight holding up the deadhead move, we undertook a gamble with this angle. However, it ultimately proved to be worthwhile to capture such a reflective image. Recognizing this hike-in, we regrettably were unable to gap the train from the time it left Brewster until Wellington, Ohio, as the train experienced delays while waiting for CSX freight traffic. Included in the consist would be NKP EMD SD9 number 358, as it is scheduled to travel to the Indiana Northeastern Railroad alongside the 765 for their Indiana rail experience. We would capture another of the Wheeling and Lake Erie's fallen flag units sitting here at the Hartland Yard. EMD SD40T-2 number 5413 would be one of two what is nicknamed tunnel motor locomotives on their roster, and it was quite the treat having 765 pass it. In Bellevue, a surprise was gifted by Norfolk Southern as their Nickel Plate Road Heritage Unit number 8100 was designated to assume the responsibility of piloting them across NS's Fostoria and Huntington districts. What was intended as a half-day outing evolved into a full-day memorable adventure. At Fostoria, the 1907 Baltimore and Ohio depot can be observed positioned between NS's Fostoria District and CSX's Willard Subdivision. To our astonishment, during setup, we discovered a vintage Pepsi sign on the structure across the street, identified as the rail. A speed restriction of 10 miles per hour would be enforced within their track authority at the Auglaize River Bridge and the Little Auglaize River Bridge in Oakwood, Ohio, thereby facilitating the capture of both rail truss bridges, which are located slightly more than a mile apart. Despite being behind the NKP 8100 in the lead position, the engineer in the Berks cab activated the throttle once again, which was a delightful opportunity to observe, as these rails are home to her. The Heritage unit would throttle up, producing a notable GE rumble, while the 765 would sit back and relax while rolling coal, creating the impression that the GEVO had experienced a malfunction or decided to be an Alco for the moment. Despite a modest rainfall in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the addition of a heritage unit to the front constituted merely one of the unexpected occurrences of the day. NS authorized the 765 to enter the East Wayne Yard while being pushed from behind by NKP 8100, which facilitated a smooth transition onto the connection leading to the Huntington District. The HU would tow the consist to the interchange with the INER located at Montpelier, Ohio, in a configuration known as Longhood Forward. Given that it is a GE locomotive, the nickname yielded by most rail fans for these circumstances would be known as Hammerhead style. This depot of Wabash Railroad heritage, built in 1890, stands the test of time, and with this being a must-have angle for myself, all attempts to mitigate the effects of the rain, unfortunately it received a water droplet at the center of the framing. However, I remained content to incorporate it, particularly as I was fortunate to witness such an uncommon occurrence, as the prolongation of the day yielded its reward with our final shot. Lo and behold, unexpectedly we would capture another whistle versus horn battle, featuring the Nathan 6-chime 80s tuning whistle, and a Nathan K5HL on the passing NS train. NS 955 would follow behind this manifest once receiving their signal from the dispatcher. During this time we would gas up, grab a bite to eat really quickly, and catch up with the train. Given the distance traveled and the prolonged duration of this day, we opted for a perspective that consistently distinguished itself, since its documentation during a prior nightly deadhead movement to the Indiana Northeastern Railroad. It would be in downtown Eden, Ohio, where a signal located next to the grade crossing emits a flashing indication upon activation of this crossing gate, thereby alerting to the arrival of an upcoming train. Steam locomotives operating at night provide an exceptional sensory experience. Upon advancing the throttle as the 765 entered town, the nickel plate road Burke demonstrated significant stack torque. However, it subsequently experienced multiple instances of slippage due to the light rain that had occurred immediately prior. The engineer established control and addressed the weather conditions, propelling the old iron horse to track speed, passing a lone grain elevator in the midst of the small downtown area, en route to the INER Hudson shops. concluding our program, we express gratitude to all participants who made this come to fruition, in addition to those who contributed to help make this program become a reality. This won't be our last time documenting the Berk this year, so make sure to listen for the whistle. But not just any whistle. The voice of Reading T1 number 2100 or American Freedom Train number 250 would be aboard the 765 during one of the Indiana Rail Experience's tri-state excursions. Despite partial documentation due to my availability, this was such a monumental moment for all of us a part of the restoration crew at the American Steam Railroad Preservation Association, Inc., as it shows we are growing closer to having a living, breathing old iron horse once again. Make sure to donate to our cause with the links in the description and also popping up in the eye in the top right corner of this video. Make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on so you don't miss this upcoming video.